Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours.
My guest, Jeff Carreira, and I speak the same language. I call it the language of the soul in everyday vocabulary. We talk about how the frustrations we face in ordinary life are also spiritual frustrations with spiritual solutions. If you have ever longed for a deeper life, then Jeff Carreira is a tender and insightful guide to help you find your way. I hope you enjoy this show with author, teacher Jeff Carreira as enlightening as I did. Enjoy. Jeff Carreira, welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Hey, Charlie. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
I got to tell you, I'm so excited about our conversation today because, you know, as I've thought about it and you know, we chatted earlier this week, it seems to me we wander about in the same playground. And I'm calling it the integration of ordinary life and the spiritual implications as well as the driving forces of such a playground. So it shall be a fun playground of ordinary life and spiritual implications. Does that sort of sound like our playground to you?
It certainly rings true from our earlier conversation, and it's definitely, you know, I've always been most interested in the creative and incarnate potentials of spirituality. So how does it show up in life? So I think in that sense, you and I are peas in the same pod.
That's great. Well, we'll see as we go on. Now I did my research, and you know, it appears to me that you have written more than 20 books. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes.
Holy cow! That's a lot of writing, my friend.
Yes, I'm very inspired to write. I've written a lot, even recently, and I have a very healthy production schedule, book writing schedule for the next few years because I have a lot of things I want to say. So I have a lot of books I want to write. That's
funny. After I wrote my first book, I said it would be my last book because I said everything I know. I don't know what else to say. And there were then, of course, more to follow. But that was, I felt like after my first book, I'm done. You know, there's nothing left in there to say to anybody. And it was funny. It was a whole different kind of book. And I also noticed, not only do you have 20 books, you have an additional 20 online courses to help people find peace with who they are in the world, both earthly and spiritual peace. You certainly are a quite prolific artist. I can't wait for our chat.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think, you know, that's very true, and it's something, it's always come very natural to me, but people often comment on the sheer volume of creative output that I tend to unleash on the world. So it's sort of a God-given energy or something, but I'm not slowing down yet.
That's good, and you know what's interesting is that there's a lot of I read through all the titles of your book and of your books and your courses. Although they are in the same sort of genre, there's a lot of diversity. It's not saying, it doesn't appear that you're saying the same thing over and over again. That there's a lot of creativity taking place in what you're doing with your your direction.
I'm interested in a lot of things. And I've recently started writing some fiction as well, and I've just always been very full of enthusiasm in many different directions, and I've done lots of different things, and so I found a good medium to express it all.
Well, you know, that you said you found different things. You've really kind of led us into the next place I want to go is... Now, as I understand, if I understand this correctly, you came to a lot of your observations after more than 20 years of deep involvement in spiritual communities and spiritual reflection in meditation and contemplation. I'd love for you to give us an overview of sort of how you got to where you are today. Now, I know this could be the entire show, but feel free to give us an overview of that.
Sure. I mean, my path was an interesting one. And I would say that I started out studying physics and became an engineer. I did that for a number of years. And at some point, we started to do a lot of military contracts, and I really lost interest in the work. And I went back to school, and I studied special education, and I became a special needs teacher. And I did that for a while. And somewhere along the path, I found meditation, and I started doing Buddhist meditation in practice. I also spent a lot of time at a Franciscan Christian monastery studying the mystics and studying Thomas Merton. So I always had a very rich spiritual life in various directions. And then at some point I met a spiritual teacher and a spiritual community that just radically changed my understanding about what life could be about, which essentially meant I realized that I could devote my life to my spiritual pursuits, that they didn't have to be what I did on the side. They could be the center of my life. And so I became part of this community. We did enormous amounts of practice, meditation. Philosophy we were following was firmly rooted in a Hindu form called Advaita Vedanta, but we were exploring all kinds of additional practices, additional Eastern practices, Buddhist and Western practices, and also just spiritual Western thought and human potential movement thought. So I was basically busy with that for 20 years, doing many hours of practice and study and contemplation and discussion with peers. And about halfway through that, I started teaching myself. And as so often happens with communities, that one ended. It after 27 years, of which I was there for 20, it fell apart, it collapsed, it ended.
But it served you. It served your needs, and it grew you.
Yes, it grew me. It was, it had its good. It had its good, bad, and ugly parts, like human life tends to have.
Like life, yeah.
Not much different than the rest of life. But yeah, somehow I managed to really, I think, get the best of what it had to offer and avoid a lot of the worst. And so I emerged from that community. I knew a lot of people. I had been the director of education of our programs, and so it was very natural for me to continue to teach, and that's essentially what I did, and that's what I've done for the past 8 years or so.
So you certainly are the person to talk to about this, and one of the things I think I would like to make clear on this show is that there's a misunderstanding even among current mystic teachers and mystic students that there is something really special about the mystics. They've got this really unique relationship with the divine, and they have visions and sort of extraordinary experiences. And the people that I'm reading now, especially I'm reading a 13th century mystic, Julian of Norwich, and she is very strong on the ordinary life, on the integration of daily life and this so-called mystical spiritual life, that the mystical spiritual life is not just this time with the divine or with God or with whatever the higher source may be. Let me give you a little quote that I read on Julian and see what you think of this. I'm really falling in love with Julian of Norwich, and she was just, for those who wouldn't know, she was an anchoress, which means she was confined to an apartment her entire life. She could never leave it. Never leave. And they brought her food into her, and she had a window on the street where people came by and got spiritual counseling from her. And so she had interactions with people, but she never left. And there was another window that led in to the sanctuary so she could participate in services. It was at a church. But she just, an anchorist or the anchorite, they live completely alone. And she wrote this. No, she didn't write this. Robert, and if I'm going to mess up his last name, but Gruworth, I believe, is the way you pronounce it. And he wrote this of Julian. Julian realizes that she does not need extraordinary mystical or visionary experience to realize the compassionate intimacy with the divine. Julian sees ordinary human life, if lived in surrender, as a way of divine intimacy, and closes with this: if there is a bridge to divine reality, it is already here in our ordinary life. How does that quote strike you?
Well, that it strikes me as beautiful. It strikes me as very true. I feel very aligned with that sentiment. This is tricky territory because, like you said, spiritual experience, kind of extraordinary experiences, they tend to get all the press.
The Teresa of Avila's.
Yeah, because they're extraordinary and they're inspiring and they're exciting. And it's not to say that they're not valuable. Certainly, they are valuable. They aren't the point. They aren't what really matters. And I love what you said in that quote, or what was said in that quote, that really living a surrendered life is what brings you in divine union. That's what brings you in contact with divine, not explosive experiences, not profound mystical experiences. I mean, those have evidently helped in some people's cases, and the experiences that I've had have certainly helped me, but they're not the point. And I often will tell people that what is so beautiful about meditation, and this, I take a particularly mystical approach to meditation. Not always. Sometimes I'm just teaching in a more secular way, but I also am very inspired by the fact that when we sit and we just do nothing, we don't try to change our experience, we don't try to manipulate our experience, we don't try to make anything other than what it already is. We just simply sit and rest, perfectly content with the way things are. I don't see any higher form of worship than that, because to me that feels like placing yourself sort of right in the arms of the divine and saying, I trust you completely, and so I feel no need to try to change anything. I feel perfectly relaxed and perfectly content to just be with you. And so in terms of union with the divine, I feel that kind of surrender into silence is some of the most powerful experiences that I personally ever have. So I feel it feels very resonant. Now, of course, she's talking about in life, and there's an equivalent in life, which is to live a surrender to the process of living, which is actually a little bit more complicated.
I've never heard that term. I like that, surrender to the process of living.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very familiar with surrendering our, what I call our small self, our selfishness, and our self-needs and self-centeredness, but surrender to the process of living, because that's a beautiful idea, Jeff. That's really good, because there is a process of living that we're trying to make, that we're trying to almost epiphanize it and make it holy, or we look at it as if it's completely unholy when it's not. When we surrender to that process, then we are surrendering to the divine.
Right, absolutely, because, life is the divine. There's not a separate divine.
Yes, I so agree.
There is no other divine that's outside of life. This process, this energy, this life force that moves us, that animates us, that creates everything, that's what the divine is.
Precisely.
So yes, there's no other place to find it except in life.
I always struggled, in my early days before I was really, really so steeped into this tradition, but I've always dabbled with it, and I always struggled with the idea of the spiritual and secular life, to say there is no such thing. There is no life that is not the spiritual life, because if we believe in the divine, if we believe in God, or ever how we want to determine that, then this entity is involved in every single aspect of life, not just this worshiping in a holy center, in a meditative surrounding, or in a church, or in an ashram, or in a mosque. It's not. That's not. It's not defined distinctly by those appearances. The spiritual life is life. There is no life that is not spiritual life.
Right, absolutely. And what's interesting about that is the whole idea of there being a secular life is really a very modern invention. Prior to the arising of the Enlightenment and rational thinking and the scientific worldview, in the Middle Ages, they didn't talk about a spiritual life as opposed to another life. There was, as you're saying, it was just life, and God was the source of it, and that was it. Nobody thought differently. So it wasn't until people started to believe or started to disbelieve in some kind of higher power that all of a sudden the idea of a secular existence was born.
Yeah, I have never heard that, but in all my readings, that supports what you're saying. I mean, I even look, going back quite a ways, but going back, they may not talked about the divine life, but they certainly talked about what I may call the divinity of the ordinary life, and that's the Stoics. I mean, look at the Stoics. Everything in life itself, in your ordinary living, and what you did on a regular basis, talked about your character, your internal being, who you were on the interior. And the Stoics were very, to talk to them about a secular life and a thoughtful life would be like, what are you talking about? What is the difference?
Right, absolutely. And I often will in speaking to people or teaching, I will point out that if you think about it, and you think about life, the whole thing is a miracle. The fact that you and I are speaking, the fact that we understand language, the fact that we're even here, none of this am I responsible for. I couldn't create a world and a body and a mind if I hadn't been given it. Then I would be lost. And I often like to point out to people that in order to not see how divine and how miraculous life is, you have to ignore almost everything. Because it's almost all miraculous, and the little bits that aren't are usually what we end up focused on if we're somehow missing that point.
It's funny. I was on a plane one time, sitting next to a physicist, and I asked her. I said, "With everything you know about the elements of the cosmos, how do physicists not believe in a teleological argument, in that there is a purpose and that there is some entity that put this all together?" And she was not a person of faith by any means, but she said, just stubbornness. It's just we're too stubborn to admit that it's not all about us. And I thought that was such a fun response, and she was quite a bright person. You know what I want to do now is I really, part of the intention of this podcast is I want to bring this so-called, this almost airy-fairy mysticism contemplation, which, I spend so much time doing. I want to bring it down to earth, and you talked about that I really liked, in our conversation, that most of us, that our entry into the spiritual life for most of us can be discovered in our disappointments, our stresses, and our pressures of everyday life. And we are looking for a way to somehow manage this discombobulated existence in what I call the accomplishment-oriented culture. But I'd like to know, from your point of view, how do you describe, or describe the relationship of stress, pressure, and the American way of life? How does just that by itself impact our souls? How does that impact our inner life?
Well, we can. This is a great question. So let me just back up one step.
Sure.
When I'm teaching meditation in a more secular context, I usually start with my own little miracle, which was actually a pretty big deal to me. But as a young person and as a young man, I was incredibly anxious, as so many people are. And one of the things that I suffered from was very bad eczema, which is a skin condition which is often, somehow seems to be connected to emotions. And early on in my spiritual life, after discovering a spiritual community, I had a very, very powerful spiritual awakening in meditation. And my eczema went away. I mean, I had eczema since I was a small child. And at this point, I was probably 32 years old. And I'm now 56. And I haven't had it since. And what's interesting is I can describe all kinds of amazing spiritual experiences that I've had. But often, what moves people the most is the fact that meditation seemed to cure my eczema. And that's because people can relate to that. Because as you're saying, the stress of life, we live in a cultural context which puts so much pressure on us to accumulate wealth, to seek for happiness, to try to build a life of happiness. It convinces us that every next thing is going to be the thing that makes us happy. And we end up in that wheel of constant accumulation and all the pressures associated with it. And people are really suffering. I do some individual coaching with people, and many of them are just profoundly suffering with symptoms of anxiety and stress.
Jeff, I had to leave my career because of anxiety. Mm-hmm. I was an executive coach to high-level business executives, and I got to where I would get anxiety of going to see them, and I had great relationships. I mean, it was not like there was nothing stressful, there were no problems. I had wonderful relationships, and I started stuttering. I mean, I couldn't even have a conversation without stuttering, and it was all anxiety, and I don't know where that came from, but it does, anxiety especially, does replicate itself in our physical beings, in the way we live everyday life. And I agree that meditation was a great help. Mm-hmm.
No, it's amazing. And the thing that when I'm successful in really changing the way someone's thinking, it's a fairly simple realization that I call the miracle of meditation. It's a simple realization, but that doesn't mean it's not subtle and challenging also. But we are convinced, and we're culturally conditioned to believe that we cannot be content and happy and relaxed unless our minds are content and happy and relaxed. And so because of that, we're constantly trying to manage our inner atmosphere, our inner mental atmosphere. We're constantly trying to give ourselves happy experiences, give ourselves pleasant experiences, avoid negative experiences, avoid pain. And what I really endeavor to do with people is to show them that actually you can't avoid negative experiences. You can't avoid pain. Of course, we all want to feel better. We all want to have more pleasant experiences, but you're never going to completely avoid the negative challenges of life. But the fact that those exist doesn't mean that you have to be discontent. You can still be just as relaxed and open and content, even in the midst of challenging experiences, if you learn that you're not your mind, that your mind might be experiencing all kinds of things, but you don't have to go with it.
I have never read nor heard that, just in that that you are not your mind, because I am cursed with being a thinker. And with the curse of thinking, I can run that risk of being where my mind is, that's where I am. And yet I know the holy and the divine and my inner spirit are apart from my mind, but I've never thought of it in that terms, that in those terms, that I am not my mind. And my mind is actually, can be an enemy. You know what I want to do is I want to continue with this, and what you were talking about is a whole different kind of joy. And
yes,
it is not in line with what we particularly in American culture will define as joy. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take a break, and then I want to come back, and I'd like you to describe to us what this different kind of joy might look like. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's
okay,
perfect.
Let's take a break. Hi, all. This is Charlie Hedges, and you are listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie. Today, my special guest is Jeff Carreira, and Jeff is an unusual mystic. We hear so much about mysticism, and it just sounds so airy-fairy and so otherworldly and so wonderfully at peace with the divine, and nothing in life matters except that you are, floating on a cloud with God, and that is, there are certainly bits of truth to that. Certainly there are bits of truth to that, but there's a whole different aspect, and Jeff brings a very balanced approach. He brings that approach, but he brings a balanced approach. And we talked at the break, before we started the break, that Jeff was going to describe to us what a different kind of joy is. Instead of the joy of the mind, instead of happiness and all that we seek, that there is a different kind of joy in life. Jeff, tell us about that.
Fantastic. Well, Charlie, what I'd like to do is start with a very brief story about one of the most profound spiritual experiences that I had, because I think it illustrates that deeper joy in a way that's hard to just talk about. But I was on a meditation retreat, and the reality is I was not born a good meditator. I really did not like meditation, and I struggled to even stay awake, usually, in meditation for years. So on this retreat, I vowed that I would not fall asleep during meditation, and so I did everything I could to stay awake, including biting my tongue, sitting in uncomfortable, anything that would keep me awake. And one night, while I was incredibly tired, but I was meditating, so I was forcing myself to stay awake, I suddenly had this very strange thought that I'm not really tired. And suddenly, everything shifted. And my body was just as tired. My mind was just as tired. I still had all the symptoms of being tired. But the person that was seeing those symptoms was completely awake. And I realized that I am not the mind or the body. I'm the awareness that's aware of the mind and the body. And that awareness is always aware, and it's always awake, and it's always okay. And what happened was I went to sleep that night, and I felt my body fall asleep. I felt my mind fall asleep, but I was still there. My mind and body were completely asleep, and I was there. And then suddenly, a dream occurred, and I was in a gas station in this dream. And I realized, oh my God, now I'm dreaming, but I'm still awake. And then the dream went away, and I was gone, but I was still awake. And then eventually I woke up, and for 3 days I couldn't lose consciousness. So I was conscious and awake all day, and I was conscious and awake while my body and mind slept at night. And what I discovered in the Hindu tradition, they speak about that as Turiya. It's the fourth state, so it's beyond waking and sleeping states. And in that recognition, I just found myself fascinated by life, fascinated by the experience of being in a body, walking around, having breakfast. I had no idea anymore what the difference between meditating and not meditating was, because I was just conscious awareness all the time. Whether I was walking around, having breakfast, or sitting in meditation, it all seemed somewhat irrelevant, but all kind of fascinating. And suddenly, I just thought, to be a conscious being is so miraculous. There's a sense, this deep sense of how lucky I am to be alive and to be conscious. And that depth of joy, you would say, joy of life, joy of being alive, gratitude for being alive, is there, And of course, on the surface, there's moments things that make you happy, things that make you unhappy, things that make you angry, things that make you sad, things that make you excited. Life continually stimulates on the surface fluctuations of our experience, some more pleasant, some less pleasant. But below that surface, there is this underlying joy of being that is part of all of our experience. It's just we don't normally see it because we're normally so focused on the fluctuations of the surface, and we're trying to always get that surface to stop fluctuating. And because we're so focused on the surface of our being, we're disconnected from the depths that exist there, the depths of beingness, the depths of awareness, awakeness. In the Hindu tradition, they speak about it as Satchidananda, truth, consciousness, bliss. It's the underlying joy of being, and it's completely independent of what might be happening on the surface. And so the more, ideally our spiritual practices, our spiritual studies bring us more and more in contact with the joy of being alive, with the essential majesty of being alive. And yes, the ups and downs of our fluctuating experience continue, but they don't bother us so much in the same way. They don't become what it's all about, because now
they're no longer defining you.
Exactly. That's beautifully put. They're no longer the most important thing, because now you've discovered something more.
I have found that would be the way I would describe divine union, is that that in that awareness, in the union with the divine, there is an awareness of all that is going on, and I like that there's some sort of healthy attachment to the things that are going on in our life, but there's a detachment, and it's really critically written in the studies that I have done, is annihilation of self and detachment, and that we must detach ourselves from not from the situation, but the way I've put it, this is a Charlie interpretation, is that we don't necessarily detach ourselves from the situation, but we detach ourselves from that situation emotionally and physically driving us to what we decide what we're going to do in action. That it is no longer the driver. It is existent. It is real. We suffer with it. We deal with it, but it is not the driver of the action. There is something much purer, which, in my tradition we call love and service, and those supersede all of these other things. And I love your idea again of awareness of this. Go ahead.
It's interesting. The Christian tradition, the Christian mystical tradition, and what I'm aware of the Hindu mystical tradition, have different language, but in the end, what they're describing, from my experience at least, seems so similar. And I love your use of divine union, because that awareness, that joy of being, that the awareness that's behind everything, that's always there, that's alive in me and alive in you and alive in every single individual. I believe that's what in a Christian tradition would often be talked about as the divine or God.
Go ahead.
Well, when we contact that, when we rest in that, when we recognize that is who we are, that's when I think we're experiencing divine union.
It's almost as if you're reading my, I told you my notes are chords that direct our conversation, and it's also as if you've gone on to the next chord, because that's exactly what I want to talk about. Let me read. I wrote a couple of sentences here, and then I want your impression of them. I am deeply involved in Christian mysticism, but that is almost a misnomer, because mysticism is found in several traditions, each with their own distinction. And so it's involved in religious and non-religious, but they each have their distinctions, yet they are so similar. But while Christian mysticism may focus, the focus in Christian mysticism is always on the Christ. But I have found almost shocking similarities in other traditions. In fact, today, as of the last couple of weeks, after deep study of half dozen Catholic mystics, Roman Catholic mystics, I am now using Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. Those are my inspirational readings. Those are what I'm writing on the mystical life every morning, and I write about 15,000 words of journal a month, and I'm journaling the idea that I'm finding such Christian concepts, that we would call Christian concepts, in Lao Tzu, but he didn't write them as Christian concepts. He wrote them just as truth, as wisdom,
right,
as the created truth and the created wisdom that is with all humanity. And with that, I'm going to ask you a really difficult question, and then we're going to get into your book before we close.
Okay.
But I think you've probably answered this, but let's just kind of sum it up. What would be, because I'm still really interested in my everyday listener that's listening to this podcast that is not studying and deep into mysticism, and sometimes prayer and contemplation can seem like this otherworldly, strange place. Tell me about your concept of mysticism, especially as it relates to the everyday person. I know we've dealt with that all over, but if you would kind of sum that up for me.
Absolutely. And one of the languages I like to use, because everything's about what language do you use, but one of the languages I like to use is around the idea of a paradigm and a different paradigm. And so mysticism, in a way, is a different paradigm. It's a different way of looking at reality. And the thing is, we are all inside of a paradigm. And in the secular Western world, the world that most Americans are living in, there's a story about reality. And it doesn't seem like a story when you're inside it. It just seems like that's how reality is. And it has to do with you needing to accumulate, to attain things, you needing to create the circumstances that will make you happy. It's a story that tends to point outward to find happiness, to find fulfillment. You'll find it in the right job or the right relationship or having enough money or having the right friends or going on vacation, But everything is tending to point you outside. And what the mystics discover of all traditions is that true fulfillment is found within. And that's what mystics tend to do. They look within. They find that source of inner joy, the one that isn't dependent on circumstance, and they learn to rest in that. And then as they rest in this inner joy, they start seeing through the facade of the ideas about needing and accumulating, and you just start to see. Oh, it's all a story. It's not actually true, And then the further you follow that path, the more it becomes obvious. There are just as many unhappy people who are rich as there are unhappy people who are poor. Accumulation doesn't seem to do anything.
No.
Necessarily to help. And so you just, the whole idea of mysticism is that you look under the surface. So we all have a surface reality. It's the story that our culture has told us about what's true. Of course, most people that you meet are going to believe that story. We all believed it at one point or another, and still do.
We're inculcated
to a greater extent. What's that?
I said we're just so inculcated with it.
Yes,
on a regular basis.
Look, there it is. Mm-hmm. And the mystics start to see beyond that story. They start to see a deeper reality, and the deeper reality that they see leads to a kind of fulfillment that just isn't available in the cultural story. So that's how I would sum up mysticism for a kind of non-mystic.
So I want to talk about your latest book, Higher Self-Expression, and I love the subtitle, How to Become an Artist of Possibility. Is that the book, or what book would you say would be best for our readers to understand that? Does this book do that?
Yeah, I mean that is it's actually not even totally my most recent book, but it is.
Oh, it's not. Oh, okay.
Recent book. No, I've written. I have a couple of things coming out. One just came out, and another one. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But this is a really significant book, and I think in that book people will find the heart and soul of what I teach and what I believe, which is right along the lines of what we're saying. I believe that spiritual pursuit, mystical pursuits, are the value of them is their creative potential, because we live in a world of possibilities, and there's only so many things possible in this world. But truly creative people, they begin to sense things, envision things, imagine things that could be possible but aren't yet. And as they envision those possibilities and articulate those possibilities, explore those possibilities with more and more people, they become possible. And that's how new possibilities are born into the world. And when you look, and that's what I do in this book, when you look at spiritual figures, so in this book I talk about the Hindu saints, Ramana Maharshi of the 20th century and Ramakrishna of the 19th century. I also talk about another Christian spiritual hero of mine, Thomas Merton. But right alongside them, I speak about great literary figures like Anais Nin, Fernando Pessoa, Gertrude Stein, artists like Kandinsky, and even big wave surfers and extreme sports artists. And what I'm showing is that to these people who are so explorers on the edge of the possible, whether they are inside of an explicitly spiritual context, or even if they're doing extreme sports, they relate to what they're doing as spiritual. It's their way of finding the divine.
Absolutely. Do you have to be do you have to be a special? Is there something that is needed to be a creative person, or do you feel like there is a creative dimension to most people or to all people?
And the way that I would want to say that, Charlie, is that we live in an inherently creative universe. That awareness that we are is inherently creative. It created this whole world, and it created every single thing in it, and every thought that's ever occurred to anyone was created in that source of awareness that is divine. And we are all that. And so the only thing that's required, I don't believe that people have creative talents. I believe that people are open to the creative flow of the divine, of the universe, of the cosmos. And so what's required, and what I try to teach and what the book is about, is how do we open to all of that creative potential so that more and more of it can flow through us and into our lives in different ways.
That's beautiful. I'm interested. Usually a podcast host would have read the book, but I haven't read the book, and now you've convinced me I need to get the book. I wish I could get it before I go to China on Sunday, but I doubt I can get it that quickly. This sounds like a very important read. I really want to encourage everybody that this really is the art of life. This is the beauty of life, and we are so inundated. I'm such an anti-media, anti-press person. We are just so inundated with garbage and with problems and with troubles and with let's have contradiction, and let's not have unity, and this is a whole different life. And this offers so much more, and you bring so much to the table. I am going to put your website, which is jeffcarreira.com, right?
Mm-hmm, that's right.
Okay, so I'll put your website on the show notes. I will put an Amazon link on your book on the show notes that I want people to get a hold of you. Is there anything that in wrapping up, anything you would like our audience to know that we haven't talked about?
Well, all I would want to say is thank you, Charlie, for having me. It's really been a pleasure to speak with you, and thank everybody who's listened. And I just want everyone to know that I know these are difficult times, but we have the power to really make new possibilities for the world, and I think that's the most important thing we can do together, is create a new possibility for the world. So I think that's what you're doing with this podcast, Charlie, and I'm very grateful that you invited me to be on it.
Oh, it's such a pleasure having you on it, Jeff. This is really incredible, and I want to thank you for being on the podcast and spending time with me. And I just love the discussion, and especially since it's so rare to talk to somebody that is in this tradition as I, and that is as astute as you are with such great insight. Thank you so much. I've really loved having you on the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Charlie. I loved it as well.
I want to thank all our listeners for tuning into The Next Chapter with Charlie, and be sure to check us out at our website, thenextchapter.life. And if you want these podcasts and weekly podcasts and weekly blogs, just sign up and they will show up on podcasts show up on Wednesday, blogs show up on Sunday. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.